Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Gerlach, and this is another talk on Chinese philosophy and Mozi, the most strangely overtly communist of the ancient famous Chinese warring states philosophies and philosophers, the Hundred Schools, Hundred Sages period, who also, curiously enough, is into worship of the local animistic spirits. So please see the first talk that I gave last time on all of that. And now we are going to kick back in here with a bit more Mozi, and I am going to explain why right after here we had the point, paradoxically, Mozi does say when we look at things dispassionately, we see the dispassionate ruler is best. So, as I said, well, do we trust the dispassionate or the internationalist or the impartial best or more or not, or should we? And I did mention, and we stopped last time with saying, Mozi was a Confucian. He was more extreme than the Confucians, and the Confucians are very much Aristotle to Plato. A balance is best. This is too kind of communistically extreme, but Mozi, kind of like Plato, would say, but if we want things they're most mathematical, an Egyptian priest, which is not Mozi, that would be Plato, and most Pythagorean and Egyptian is what Plato argues in his Timaeus, we would have something, well, Timaeus argues that, as Plato's character, in the Timaeus of his own name. Mozi is saying if we want most brute, secure food and funerals for everyone, we should take Confucianism a lot farther than the Confucians and universal love. And Mozi argues all problems, both of individuals and of society, are caused by bias and partiality. So I ended off on that point, and also on the point, is it that we judge, and Mozi says, no, just as we would trust the impartial guy we see be even-keeled with himself and others with our family members as we go to war, we would also trust internationalism or loving all families together as one, and that we would trust that more in everyone. Well, it is very weird and interesting he argues this, and I don't really want to be against it. It's not entirely my political position at all, but it is my political position as, again, not what I'm presenting you with. It is more that these angles are very interesting to talk about in Greek and Chinese and Indian thought. And we have here partiality, the problem of the one and the many. And it is interesting to say, well, no, we would trust somebody who doesn't create divisions and just seeks absolute unity. But we do and don't trust that. And when we do have modern times, the easiest thing to say to a modern audience is, if you think about modern people in the middle with Aristotle and Confucius, looking at Mozi and communism as extreme, let's say, Mozi and Plato as extreme communism, and then thinking we need to be middle people between extreme communism and extreme fascism, which that's putting politics too simply, but let's put it that simply for a moment. You would not say we see everybody gravitating towards one position or the other on either extreme and trusting that entirely, right? Let's just leave all the politics right there and keep on going with Mozi. If you trust that I'm telling you, no, we don't trust entire left or right or communal or nationalism entirely as people, like, because that tends to be a little odd, then we can keep going here without getting any more political than that. We're already in political country, of course, all of them. So, with all of that, I am teaching you more Chinese philosophy and Mozi, and kind of Aristotle versus Plato, but over in China, oddly, and rearranged as Mozi, who is more extreme the Confucian than the Confucians, and being kind of the communist. And whether or not Confucius or Mencius think that's okay or not, which they don't. They also don't want you to be a hippie Taoist anarchist. And so it's interesting that it's hard for me, and I think for many in the audience in general, to not think about, which is just what we project as people of our world today, in whatever translations, I would say, and just abstractly, sort of generally, vaguely do that as best as any of us do or don't, as we expect we do or don't, that Mozi here is kind of arguing for somewhat like communism. Taoism is arguing for something like anarchist hippiedom. And the Confucians are basically looking at both as stern, more grounded Republican dad, like, no, 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 no. Both of those are extreme. Now, that's definitely not necessarily how Mozi or the Taoists would paint themselves, but we actually have many, many Taoist texts. The Taoists were supported and get to talk for themselves. The Moists did, and we have their texts. They were eclipsed. They are the one of the 4 major of the 100 major schools and sages who get eclipsed and not picked up by the Qin or the Han and become Confucianism and Taoism, and also legalism, but legalism was dropped with the brief Qin. So into the Han as the major dynasty of ancient China, as far as the golden age of philosophy. So, Mozi believes in universal love. He says everything is bias other than this. Is he right or not? And how much should one, as in India, the 3rd major school of Chinese thought from India, but comes over and joins Confucianism and Taoism as the 3rd major school. How much should we give up on particularity and individuality? It's a good point to make here, because Mencius seems terrified by Moism. He also, in thinking that Moism, Mencius in the Warring States period thinks that Mozi, who clearly is a Confucian but a more extreme anti-Confucian Confucian, he seems to treat Mozi as his major rival in northeast China at the time, but also, extremely opposite, a guy named Yang Chu, who was one of the 100 sages of the 100 schools of the Warring States, golden age of Chinese philosophy, horrible Warring States period also, time of political instability before the brief Qin and then the Han dynasty, keeping China relatively stable. Mencius says, the ideas of Yang Chu and Mozi fill the world. And this is expected to be, in context. It's terrible that on one extreme you have Yang Chu, and on the other extreme you have Mozi, and so many people are not balanced with the golden mean with Mencius in the middle, and are too much into Yang Chu on one end, and too much into Mozi on the other end. Now, why would Mencius be saying that Yang Chu is who on what end here? Well, we don't know much about Yang Chu other than here, and then there is a limited scholarship and limited text mentioning him. This makes him a little bit possibly like somebody like Nietzsche or somebody like Potapada in the Buddhist sutras, who the discourses of the Buddha, who is kind of an individualist or says everyone for themselves, but it's not clear, just like when somebody is called an atheist, what does that mean? They're a pantheist? What? In ancient times or medieval or even pre-modern times. It's not clear by being an individualist or even Darwinian or something like that, which is the vague implication of what scholars suggest, what Yang Chu believed or what he was arguing for. But Mencius definitely says, you have Yang Chu, who's the individualist over here, who says everyone for themselves. I do like the British comedy A Fish Called Wanda, when when Wanda is berating, I believe, I haven't watched it in a while, when she is, I believe Wanda, is berating, the female lead, is berating the guy, one of the guys in the film, she says, I've been looking things up, and a lot of what you have been telling me is nonsense. The Buddha did not teach every man for himself, and the guy is getting upset that she's questioning his interpretation of philosophy. Well, I can tell you, the Buddha was not a guy who actually said, tell everybody to shut up and yammer on and on. So it is very hippie to be into think for yourself, a bit of possibly Yang Chu. It is very hippie to be kind of into Buddhism, chill yourself out. But we don't know, of course, that what Yang Chu exactly was saying, but Mencius is saying, hey, he's on the other end of me over from Mozi. So there's that, It definitely seems that Yang Chu is kind of possibly an individualist who says, hey, everyone for themselves, do your own thing, and how much is this being vilified or not? And let's just pass over that in silence, and we don't know how loving or unloving this guy is, or what he's telling you to do, or who he's telling you to be for or against, but he is definitely being portrayed as the opposite of the communist, which would probably be something like the staunch individualist libertarian and or, well, I don't know. The Taoists are kind of, again, hippie-ish anarchistic, maybe, again, something more anarchistic or Taoist. It's hard to know entirely. Again, my understandings are limited, but so is the material. The Confucians' doctrine of loving all but having particular love for one's family, friends, and country was offered as a middle way here by Mencius, between the extremes of this kind of individualism and then communism. Against Mozi, Mencius argues that loving everyone as one loves one's own father is like one has no father. That is a good central idea of Mencius here. Everyone is your dad as you have no dad. That loving everyone as one loves one's own children is like one has no children. Which is a way here, if you don't want to make it patriarchal about dad, it is also complementary side. Saying everyone is your child is like having no children in particular, which is a very interesting idea. And this, again, is, I do think that Aristotle and Confucius kind of have a point on Plato's Republic and Mozi, that we don't actually see everybody rushing into the communes and the kibbutzes, but we do see some, and we're always between these extremes. So that doesn't tell you that these guys or anyone balances it out well. Let me caution you there. But it does suggest we don't have outright say, and I'm a lefty, so I am framing things in terms of modern politics as best I can. What it does seem is Mencius is more conservative and traditional and is offering Confucius against, as a middle conservative traditional way, against something like extreme too much communism or extreme too much individualism, anarchism, libertarianism. As, let's call, and I don't want to conflate things more than that or not. I would say, I could say fascism, communism on one side as extremism or something like that. But honestly, it's like Mozi is too much of the internationalist here. And, for him to necessarily, for us to get into splitting a bunch of stuff up. So, we're not going to get into too much of that. I am just using broad labels and flags in order to kind of guide you. Airlines. Over there, Steve, from Airplane. Oh, no. That left your backpack. That, oh God, yes, the plane smash. Is that, much love out there to everyone, that you, in the broadest of ways, this definitely seems like somebody trying to steer middle way conservatively and present all these other positions as to the extreme, and thus baby bear theory is better in the middle. That's everybody, though. A lot. Although, again, you can chart a lot of thinkers by what are they balancing and what are they saying is more extreme or entire here or needs to be, So, yes, Mencius is not Mozi, but Mencius says, loving everybody as your father is like having no father. He is saying, and loving everyone as your child is having no children. That's against Mozi, to be clear. So we're covering Mozi, but that's Mencius against Mozi. Considering the emphasis that Confucians such as Mencius put on following your father, this again would be great evil and against civilization and knowing things and all of science and decency itself. Culture, just basically. I am doing a lot of Nietzsche right now, and in talking about slamming objective truth, it is just culture is the cult, man, as Terence McKenna says. And it's not science or not, a religion or not. It is objective institutions versus people. You do probably have Yang Chu as somebody who is more radically reject something like groups. And Mozi is radically incorporate the groups in an egalitarian way. Mencius finds all that too extreme, seems to be the case. Mencius, remember, argues in that against possibly, some argue Moist, Yi Tzi, that society begins with the burial of the dead, and both can agree and say, well, yes, and then the Moist would say, so let's give everyone super cheap state funerals to make sure everybody gets buried. And Mencius would say, well, you should err more on giving your family a fancier, no fake crying, but fancier, his mother moved that way, again in the past, watch the Mencius. But give your mom and dad a particular funeral, otherwise who is particularly your mom and your dad if you are as sad at everybody's funeral? There is an interesting argument here. Would we experience life differently, or is it bad to love everybody as much as each other rather than have something like the familial? Which are interesting issues. And those are interesting, very big issues today. And we're leaving it somewhat there in continuing to talk about these sorts of issues, which are serious. So The Moists and Confucians seem to be presenting two sides of an issue that touches all sorts of cultures, and I try to humanize and relativize all of this. That you can find a good example of conflict like this in the ancient Greek tragedy Antigone or Antigone. Antigone's two brothers fight each other to rule the state, and when one kills the other, he takes the throne and orders that his brother's body not be buried, which would clearly creep Mencius out, and Yeatse. Antigone is torn between obeying her brother, the state, and burying her other brother, I don't know that it's the elder. Her other brother, not the elder, dang it. She is torn between her... My apologies, I am screwing this up. I believe it is her uncle who says you cannot bury your brother who has fallen in battle, who is the traitor. Let me leave that there like that. She says, no, I have to bury my brother, even if he is a traitor to the state. Let's leave it there, because otherwise I'm going to lose sight of the details here clearly. So, basically, she picks burying her brother, which is very primordial, bury the brother here, especially if we're talking about Mencius versus the Moists, or possible Moists, accusedly. That are you, or have you ever been a Moist in front of you? Lied to this Senate committee. Basically, does Antigone, and she chooses to bury her brother, and then they bury her alive, and that's her punishment. So the state buries you for burying your brother. As I often mention to people, it is very much what happens enough that you turn in your family to the cops, and let's just leave that there, and that is very much the unfortunate territory of Mozi versus a little bit of the Confucian stuff here as far as Antigone. So in one passage of Confucius's Analects, Confucius sides with Antigone, that's 1318, arguing that a son who testifies against his father for stealing a sheep, which is very utilitarian, your father steals a sheep, you turn him in. For not protecting his family. Confucius says actually turning in your own dad for stealing a sheep is terrible. He says it's horrible. He doesn't, I think, say it's illegal or legal. He says, I hate this. Which kind of may leave it a little open and safe. But that Confucius is saying, I wouldn't expect the son to turn in the father if I were you, you know, and we're leaving that a little, the Taoists say, let the fish swim where the water is a little murky, and here, even though Confucius would not be the Taoist or advise you that way, I think he is leaving it a little murky where Confucius is saying, I would not expect a son, I would expect the father to commit more than stealing a sheep for his starving family, not to have a cool jacket, but if your father steals a sheep because you're dirt poor, you should not turn in your father. This is a little bit of the, as with Antigone, for the Americans with Antigone. And do I know how any ways to pronounce that correctly? No, not at all. So neither do you, as far as I know. That you have here a little bit of Les Miserables, Les Miserables, which is, do you chase down the poor guy who steals a loaf of bread forever because you have Kantian categorical morality, and everyone who steals a loaf of bread, no matter how homeless, must pay? And apparently Russell Crowe sings about this, or something or others. So, with all of that, do you chase the guy down forever or not who steals the loaf of bread? I have mentioned two students I've seen in a newspaper before, a website, of course, nowadays. There was an Italian court that actually ruled a homeless guy who stole food and was starving was not guilty, and then it was a brief news item. I don't think it was that picked up in a lot of countries, but it was something briefly that went around online that a local court did rule, well, this homeless guy stole, but we're going to let him go time served because basically he was trying to feed himself, and I'm not sure how much that is or isn't, again, practice, but that was pointed out as perhaps this is rare because it is rare for the law to let starving people perhaps go for just stealing once caught. It would perhaps be more murky practice perhaps to just let that slide and not fully, or not, I don't know. Here or there it could be different, of course. But you get my point, is that do you, brute utilitarian, always follow the law or not? And Mencius has already said use discretion. This isn't necessarily what the Moist would say or not, but we are talking about the realm here of do you turn in your brother to the cops or not? And I think the next question is, well, what did the cops or your brother or your dad, as I speak, do? who did what to whom and why, and then that would unfortunately have to weigh into the balance of discretion here for Mencius. And we don't get to hear as much from Mozi and the Mois because they did not survive and get patronized and fully supported. So we have all of that, and I don't think, like with Yi Tse, the Moist, the possible Moist, are agreeing, yeah, burial is where civilization started, sure, for love of parents, and then go that radically outward, even past the discretion, more for your family, less for your country, but more than for humanity as a whole, for world peace, which the Confucians, from the Great Learning onward, argue for world peace and love outward. So the Moas say, okay, radical outward, and they're like, no. There's back and forth, and so here you have wrestling with when there's back and forth, and don't turn in your father when you're poor and he steals a sheep, is actually Confucius. So you can see the balancing act, actually, in this philosophy. And no, that wouldn't simply get rid of or support the cops doing A or B, because of course it could be used probably by all sides a bunch throughout history, yes, is what I would tell you. So are the Moist and Confucian ideas of love incompatible? No, they are really weird, strangely two sides of the coin. I would say the Moist is taking Confucian ideas a little bit more radically a direction, and they think they are, and they say they are. Is the love one has for others the origin of the love one has for those one is familiar with, or is the love one has for those one is familiar with the origin of the love one has for everyone? It is an interesting issue that both of them would agree. Okay, so you start with the love you have for everyone, and then you grow out like a little child, and then you grow outward, and then everybody, right? Okay, so how much does that stack up around the familiar and the home? How much do we be nationalists? How much do we love our family more than other families? How much do we stick up for our friends versus some random jerk on the street? We don't know. And the Confucians say, well, there's more and less love, and that's natural. And the Moists are actually taking the position, if we are being human in civilization, and if we push this radically outward enough, you understand how you are feudalism standing in the way of what is good, is what the Moist is saying, with a more radical utilitarian bent to it. And actually, this is, again, how I would tell you both that, and that not only am I presenting this as if the Moists are too extreme, and so is Plato, but also Mencius and Aristotle fully support slavery. They have all sorts of things that they are totally backing, which modern people would turn a bit of their nose up at. So I'm not presenting you actually with any of these thoughts, or with Mencius presenting himself as the balance, as the correct position. I am trying to, of course, orient the positions historically. And that does seem to be the case, that Mozi was extreme and did not get picked up by folks. That definitely seems the case. So, it is interesting how much do we have a duty to provide for Americans as Americans, for Californians as Californians, for folks who are not Californians, and Americans as Californians. Onward, your town, your family, your friends. Is it you and Bonnie and Clyde against the world? It's an odd couple, but not oddest, but still. So with all of that, what are the proper ways to treat yourself and others, better or worse? And all of these people think you balance it. Actually, the Moists and the Confucians believe in the golden rule. This is how extreme you take the golden rule, my bro, is essentially what this is and what this is about. Now, notice the easy position for the Mencius and the Mencian and the Confucians and the Neo-Confucians around Mencius and Confucius is it is too imbalanced to be an outright communist. That's an easy thing for me to tell as an American, a bunch of fellow Americans. So let's at least say the Moists were extreme and tried to do something more communal. And honestly, if you're into anything like religion, then honestly, communes and kibbutzes did take under the guise of many different things, and in the name of religion first and foremost, if we are blurring all this together with modern communism too much. That actually radical communal life is taking root at this time in the name of religion and other things in monasteries, communities. And yet that isn't everybody and everybody's cup of tea. So actually to the extreme and back and forth still remains much as we're talking about it. So the Moists are, moving on to another point here, the Moists are known to be experts in both debate and warfare. Now here's another point of the Moists, and as always, if you don't like those points, as Groucho Marx says, if you don't like those principles, well, I have others. The Moas have several points that are really cool, and you can find a lot of different points in philosophy. The Moas are extremely kind of communal, radical kibbutsists, interestingly enough, but they are known to be experts in both debate and warfare, and they were supposed to be great in logic and debate and military strategy, science, and warfare, but were very insistent, and this kind of gets it into backwards, interesting ways, like the Confucians explaining why the Sage Kings did what they did when they were such balanced, brilliant people, but they just say it as if that's cool. That the Moas say you only use defense and logic for, actually, military science, for defense. This is like the Department of Defense, which of course only defends and never commits offense, and I will not be offensive past that. That you have logic and debate and martial arts are only for defending the self and the weak against the strong. Other than that, you do not use them, but you should be excellent in them. There is a great early episode of The Simpsons where Bart Simpson goes to I believe a karate class in a mall, and he shows up the first day, and as an undisciplined kid, the instructor says, "We will pass out the art of war so that we can learn the first rule of martial arts is not to fight if we cannot, or not to fight. The first rule of fighting is not to fight, if we can." And Bart says, "Yo, sensei, I already know how not to hit a dude, so when do we bust out the nunchucks?" Which, of course, is humorous play on the Taoism and the Sun Tzu strategy, which I already have those videos up. Is that, and so please watch those. I have a lot on Taoism and a bit on Sun Tzu. And he is not a Taoist, but strangely, again, sounds like one. Weirdly, again, you have another crossover here. The Moas sound like Taoists, but they are not Taoists. There are hippies-ish, but not really. They're more like the outright kind of East Coast button-down communist types. Oddly, if we're just matching cards in American politics. They definitely, and they are also into traditional animistic worship and think the Confucians don't put enough emphasis on that while pleasing the new nobles, which is, again, what it is. So, with all of that, and the interesting situation of lots of angles, that honestly is boiling it down to the simplest pieces, and still, wow, it's highly situational and human and interesting. That the Moas are kind of like Taoists and like Sun Tzu. We fight such that we need not fight. And okay, sure, sensei. But yes, funny enough, it is not about rushing on into combat. It is about knowing how to fight such that you minimalistically use fighting and strength to do absolutely the minimal amount, and that is true strength. So strong. So yes. Remember that the period of the 100 Schools is also the Warring States period. So having compassion and then strength both is very much the fatherly and the motherly. You find statues a lot in the ancient world across cultures going like this, kind of like the Lord of the Rings gigantic, impossibly tall statues that stop. Well, they have magic, in the whole universe and elves and stuff. Stop. They're eternal. They can build very tall statues if they live forever, I imagine. Think of the labor. So yes, cheap elf. Getting off track. Stop is what we should say to my sense of humor with male masculine strength, giving an offering like bountiful to you. Touchdown, Jesus. That you basically, with the Brazilians, again, sort of halvesies. With all of that, perhaps, I don't know. These are my strange thoughts. You have very much defense offering openness. Here, have some stop you, hail. And let's not otherwise, angle that. That you basically have with a lot of this stuff, kind of the back and forth, that we are strong, but so that we can never use it, but only use it just enough to protect the strong against the weak. Which is the real thing going on. I am misspeaking a lot. My apologies. Protect the weak against the strong, and actually, in fact, if this has succeeded, perhaps, like Confucianism, it would occasionally and only occasionally be used to, as it has been accused in China for a long time, and especially now, back and forth, to protect the strong against the weak, even though it is, in name, protecting the weak against the strong. That would be an American, of course, quite interpretation, wouldn't it? So, in this time of the Warring States, people need strength and they need compassion is the point. So how do you balance that out? Well, being so strong, but also only being strong as you need to be, is not overbearing like the legalists, let's hope, is what they're trying not to say they're doing. This is, funny enough, like the Swiss. If you go to Rome, you can see Swiss guards. They make the Froschies, apparently, where the newbies wear the red-plumed yellow and blue outfit with the old armor and the halberds, like the old spear types. And then you also see dudes who are there in the black. It is all male, plenty. The black all suits, and they have the shades and the earpiece, and they have submachine guns, small ones, tucked into their jacket. And then when the Pope's doing anything, looking around, looking very much like Secret Service and/or Mossad, like kicking it. Forgive my lack of, again, military science and schooling. But basically, it's like, yeah, the Swiss Guard today definitely do not dress up like that when they are protecting others. And they protected people during the, as they proudly say in their statues in Europe, during the French Revolution. They protected nobility who were Catholic and were slaughtered, and their statues to them in multiple places for, like, being the bodyguards, the Swiss. And the Swiss, famously thus, since the 1700s, are famous for being warriors who then don't commit war, and then they hire themselves out as mercenaries and bodyguards for all sorts of folks. So there you go. Protecting the Pope, protecting French Catholic royalty. Lots of old history to all of that, and you can check all that out. It's incredible. But yeah, that's kind of the Swiss stance, is that they have, as delights my 80s raised inner 7-year-old child, my inner 7-year-old boy playing with G.I. Joes, is they have bases in Switzerland which are like Matterhorn, Yodel-Lehi-Hu mountains with slots in the middle, which space kind of George Lucas Hoth-based spacecraft stuff, I swear must be partly the inspiration here, where they can actually shoot jet planes out of the side of mountains and land them kind of vertically, vertical liftoff things. They can actually figure out how to get jets in and out of mountains, the Swiss can, and have that stuff. And then they kind of keep it tucked into their trousers and or lederhosen. I don't know the common nomenclature. But, yes, they keep it, again, in their somewhat decorative pantaloons. So they don't, but they guard the Pope like heck. And, again, they probably rib the Froschies, though not with halberds, I hope. So this is the Mozi being a bit, and the Moists being a bit like the Swiss, in that they are defensive, but they're masters of defense, and thus I would not poke, the Swiss bear entirely. So, unfortunately for Mozi and the Moist schools, the unification of China was a time of great prosperity for aristocrats, artists, entertainers, and merchants. Mozi's arguments that everyone should share equally and do away with extravagant entertainment may or may not, of course, cut across all those lines and be everybody into it. A likely factor in the Han supporting Confucian and Taoism, Confucians and Taoists, but not Moists and Moism and Mozi's work. Mozi did believe that art and music were valuable, but denounced the great productions employed by aristocrats and merchants, arguing that they should use the money to feed farmers in times of famine and orphans. While the Confucians and Taoists argue for similar benevolence, the Taoists in particular suggest that it is better to feed common people than become attached to luxury. Mozi, however, focuses on entertainment as a particular target, and this did not win him much support at a time when actually appealing to artists would certainly have helped. So here perhaps, and I do like kind of Soviet realism as an interesting facet of art and art history, here we can understand the Surrealists, as I will go off on Surrealism. I like French thought plenty, and I like the Surrealists. The Surrealists would sometimes go to communist meetings, which the French have plenty, and they would say to the brute utilitarian communists, so we're surrealists, we're going to put Dali, however, was a fascist. They probably would not like you talking about Dali so much. He was decently right-wing as a Spaniard. You've bested my Spaniard. But that basically they would say, hey, get out of here, you hippie bums, or you rich kids and your silly paintings with Freudian dreams. We're trying to, create bread for the poor and have some guy with a hammer, and a chisel upright with a woman next to him with a chisel being like, yeah, we're trying to do very realist art. We don't have time for your, weird sexual dreams of things and violence, which would kind of be like something like, I think Hollywood, we could say, is both in some ways is a lefty place with some lefty political thought. In some ways it would be somewhat right-wing and somewhat very brute capitalist. It would be both of those things, and I safely here just simply bow out and say I do not know. It is not my specialty. I am thankful that it isn't. But with all of that and the mixing of cultures in which every place is something where there is contradiction and back and forth, certainly, I can see how outright, brute, button-down communism in the name of local ghosts and animism and equal funerals, and brute bread for everyone and defensive warfare, but largely defensive in warring states China, would not have appealed as much as you can get through as much to aristocrats as a lot of what you will find presented in my videos about Confucius and the Taoists. I won't say all of that here, but there's a lot in all of that that would appeal to artists, authors, rulers, strategists. Mozi is not bad. His radical stance on certain things may have made him the one. Yang Shu was way less, not nearly as good as Mozi, by the way. Let me just say, he did not become one of the 4 out of the 100 who are still known to be the 4 out of the 100 who are the most popular. And Mencius says, well, this guy versus that guy, but still, Yang Shu is not known as one of like the 5 or the 4. It is very much the 4 of these, and somebody gets to call that at some point plenty. Of course, that's judgment, but that Moism seems to, regardless of what Mencius says, have been the more popular. Again, hopefully you have been enjoying the cats who have been napping and chilling and having a cuddle puddle and a cuddle party the whole entire time. I will upload a short video of a better angle on all of that, which I took for like 45 seconds and is enjoyable. Yes. So, with all of that, we are probably going to have to break this video up into more than this video. I am going to try to chunk the videos a little bit more. I am going to put paragraphs in them as well. Chapters in them as well. Chapter headings, so you can see which points we've covered and go back over and scroll over to see, which is good. But we will mention here a little bit to round this out at about 40 minutes or so. We will mention here, as we are going on, that Moism may have been too buttoned down and utilitarian communistic for popularity with nobles and artists alike, which is the other point here I am making, that scholars often speculate about. Those are not my thoughts. Those are the thoughts I find that I like in the scholarship about Mozi that exists today. In addition to that, Mozi insists on retaining popular theism and folk belief, which is very odd. Now, this is interesting because this is in Han China afterwards. The codification of Chinese culture and folk belief and animistic belief remain popular the whole time through. But with the literati and intelligentsia and all of these folks, his insistence on retaining popular theism and folk belief versus more abstract, what we like to call philosophical monism, or talking about all in one, and not talking so this or that god or spirit. Apparently, the Confucians and Taoists noticeably did that enough that not only is it said they did that by modern scholars, but Mozi seems to indicate the Confucians in his day do this too much and are not practicing that. When Confucius says you are worried about you can't feed people, and you're worried about feeding ghosts and spirits, that Confucius is actually suggesting skimp on feeding the ghosts and spirits, which is also odd because at the same time he accuses Confucius and Confucians of appealing to the nobles and fine throw pillows and formal rules. So here, oddly, it is like, and this is definitely why this is a mixed bunch of culture here. There are some nobles who are into brute utilitarianism and not doing so much folk practice. But at the same time, that's not most of them. And most of the nobles probably did like something like a bunch of extravagant art, but also overlappingly, interlocutorly, if I learn to talk right, that we find a lot of pressures here in ancient China where Mozi's philosophy definitely was remembered and talked about, and we have texts, but it definitely, which we're going to break the video off here, and then I will start in with sections of the Mozi, his writings. Again, I was given the Burton Watson translations. I always trust those as some of the basic. They are still old I believe Wade Giles, although I believe maybe modern versions of those, the current versions, printings may have improved. But they are old Wade Giles books, but the old Burton Watson translations are still quite awesome. Or at least they are trusted old standards for a lot of this stuff, and I'm sure there's been lots of ink spilled about the particulars. So, with all of that, what we have here is Mozi saying oddly that saying all is good and one is all and that's great enough as philosophers is concerning to Mozi because he not only wants to radically change society such that there are somewhat, I suppose, radical, more equal funerals and practices and bread, which in warring states China makes a lot of sense. He also seems to think the philosopher abstract intellectuals like myself are not being theistic folk religious enough, which is funny and interesting because this is why... I like that. Somebody's gunning something in the background out there. I got the windows open for the cats. It's a little hot and all of that. It is odd because, as I mentioned in the beginning of Mozi, and this will start into a third Mozi video, as I expected, enough, because there's enough in Mozi that's just fantastic and weird and amazing, and again, whenever you say outright communism in videos, you may as well put out a bunch of more minutes of yammering about it and explaining and hemming and hawing about what the heck you're talking about, That weirdly enough, there seem to be a lot of different philosophical movements going on such that we would often think of communism as something in our day, as something aligned with intellectuals as well as possibly worker unions, I guess. And so it is odd then that Mozi is very much like insisting on kind of the lowly worker unions, but not really, I think, in particular at all as far as labor practices. Could have been a carpenter, and then is also saying folk animistic belief, and that the intellectuals are more like my kind of people who are not really serious about religion, but are being intellectual and philosophical rather than religious, which reminds me most of, I believe, it is... in one of the Indian texts of Hinduism, it does say, don't be like this scholar who went and just studied logic and debate and turned into a jackal, because if you just study logic and philosophy and don't do religion and don't burn the incense to the right folks, that could screw you up royal. So it actually does remind me of that. It's like, don't just do logic, although the Moists are oddly enough brilliant at logic and debate. They're famous in ancient China for being quite excellent, as were, of course, the School of Names folks, which I've already got videos up on. And I think the School of Names folks would be very different from these guys, and they remind me actually also of the surrealists thrown out of the... which I didn't finish that story entirely. Yeah, if you go to the communists and you say, I want to deck everything in weird dreams of sex and violence, they say we prefer realism, get the heck out. So, yeah... oddly enough, we have many different angles on many different sort of modern-like but human angles of culture, which again are quite fascinating, and these are the ways that scholars lovingly try to, not all of one mind, but portray these motions of culture back in ancient warring states China, which is the time, the 100 schools, 100 sages period, in which, the golden age of Chinese philosophy in which Mozi lived. All right, so that is a good 40-plus minute video. I am going to eat a little something, and we have one cat. I don't know where other cat went. Hopefully there was ceremonious jumping downs and some or others. Don't know where he went, but I will continue on with another video in a little while on the Mozi, the basic book, the Mozi, like the Zhuangzi is the book of Zhuangzi, even though there's more than him in it. The Mozi is the work of Mozi. So the book title is also the philosopher's name. This is also the case in the Zhuangzi. The Lao Tzu is the Tao Te Ching. So it's also known as the Lao Tzu, but it's actually the Tao Te Ching as well. So we will get into the Mozi, which is the work of Mozi, and I will break that into chapters, including beginning some of universal love against offensive warfare and against the Confucians, which, again, a couple of ideas of each of those. So, all right, much happiness, love, universal, international or national, depending on how you cut your politics, yeesh, people, and much happiness, many ideas, and fewer ideas if that's what you're having, and need to sleep. And I will see ya, if and when I ever do see ya.